If you were given the choice not to save someone but to give them the power to save you in return, would you dare? Tonight, we dive into a story where victory is not what it seems, and freedom is not given, but reclaimed slowly, painfully, through every breath, every act of defiance. A war ends. A prisoner is freed. But what happens when the rescuer and the rescued realize they are both chained not by metal, but by the weight of their past? How do two enemies become true partners, not because they owe each other but because they choose to be? Stay with me as we explore a journey that goes beyond war, beyond power, into the very core of what it means to be free, together. This is not just a sci-fi story. This is a reflection of us all. Welcome to the alien Storyverse. The war had ended, or so they said. The skies no longer burned with plasma trails, the earth no longer trembled beneath the weight of alien war machines. Yet as the banners of humanity fluttered above the shattered remains of once proud alien strongholds, a cold truth lingered beneath every cheer, every proclamation of victory. Freedom was not yet won, it had merely changed its face. In the heart of what remained of the alien dominion, amidst the skeletal remains of their grand citadels, Commander Reich Voss stood still. The golden dusk bled across the jagged spires of the conquered city, bathing the ruins in a light that seemed too warm for the sins buried beneath its stones. His boots crunched over glass and bone, shards of alien artistry now indistinguishable from the detritus of war. Every step felt like an intrusion, not of a liberator, but of a new oppressor staking his claim. Around him, his soldiers moved with mechanical efficiency, cataloging spoils, detaining the last of the alien remnants. They did not see what he saw. To them, this was a righteous conquest, a deserved retribution. But Voss had learned through bitter years that victory breeds its own chains, subtle, insidious, and often forged in the name of peace. Near the remnants of a great hall, a line of alien prisoners knelt, collars gleaming with the soft pulse of control circuits. Once, these beings had towered over humanity, their dominion unquestioned, their word law. Now, they were but specters of their former glory, their fates dictated by the victors. The irony tasted bitter on Voss's tongue. He recalled the history of Earth, how, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, liberated nations found themselves ensnared not by foreign tyrants, but by new systems of control, cloaked in promises of freedom. It was never the chains of iron that endured, but those of ideology, of necessity, of quiet submission. An officer approached, saluting crisply, yet his voice betrayed unease. "Sir, the High Council has decreed the redistribution of Dominion assets. This includes labor units, prisoners." He did not meet Voss's gaze, for he knew the weight of his words. Labor units. Such a clinical term for sentient lives. Voss felt the weight of history pressing down, the ghosts of every war fought in the name of liberation that had ended in new forms of bondage. Was this what they had fought for? To inherit the master's whip under the guise of justice? Among the kneeling figures, one alien stood out. She was smaller, frilier perhaps, but there was a defiance in the way she held herself, chin tilted just so, as if daring the universe to break her further. Her eyes, a luminous shade of amethyst, did not lower. The control collar around her neck blinked in rhythm with her pulse, a cruel mimicry of life under subjugation. Voss approached, the air thick with the mingled scent of scorched metal and decaying ideals. He crouched before her, studying not her species, nor her status, but the humanity reflected in her defiant glare. In that moment, he saw not an enemy, but a mirror, a being stripped of dignity by forces beyond her will, yet clutching to the last fragments of self. The officer's voice interrupted his thoughts, offering the same binary choice that had echoed through centuries: take her, or dispose of her. Voss's hand hovered over the control device, a single press away from compliance. But compliance with what? Victory? Justice? Or merely the perpetuation of an ancient cycle of dominance? His fingers closed not around the control, but around the collar itself. With a twist born not of strength, but of resolve, the device snapped, its lights fading like the dying breath of a long-held lie. The silence that followed was deafening. The soldiers watched, some in confusion, others in dawning understanding. This was not mercy. This was rebellion not against an enemy, but against the insidious notion that to win a war is to inherit the right to oppress. The alien woman remained still, processing the absence of pain, the sudden absence of ownership. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she reached up, fingers brushing the bare skin of her throat where cold metal had once claimed dominion. The gesture was small, but its significance thundered louder than any victory parade. As the twin suns of the alien world dipped below the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the ruins, Voss knew this was not the end of a war. It was the beginning of a far more difficult battle, the battle for what kind of victors they would choose to become. For freedom, he realized, is not won on battlefields. It is won in choices made in moments of quiet defiance, when no one is watching, when the price of doing right weighs heavier than the spoils of conquest. And in that crumbling alien city, amidst the ruins of empires, Reich Voss chose to be free. The collar gleamed, deceptively simple. A loop of metal and polymer, inlaid with delicate circuits that pulsed with a dim, rhythmic glow almost like a heartbeat, almost like life. But there was no life in this device. Only control. Only domination. Only the quiet assertion of ownership disguised as technology. It was called the Control Interface Unit by its makers. A neutral term. Clinical. Stripped of emotion, as if that could mask its true nature. But those who wore it, those who felt its bite, knew its real name. It was a chain. Not forged of iron, but of intention. Not meant to restrain the body, but to shackle the will. In the world of science fiction, such devices have always held a dark allure. From the mind-warping neural inhibitors of dystopian regimes to the bio-coded slave circuits in alien empires, the narrative is clear: controlling the mind is the ultimate conquest. To force compliance not through brute strength, but through the subversion of self, this is a mastery that transcends simple warfare. But fiction, as always, is merely the reflection of our own shadows. In the mid-20th century, beneath the polished facade of Western democracy, a project was born in secrecy. Its name, MK-Ultra. Funded by the CIA, sanctioned by Cold War paranoia, it sought to unravel the defenses of the human mind. Hypnosis, psychoactive drugs, sensory deprivation, subliminal messaging, every method was explored, every ethical boundary obliterated. The goal was singular: to create obedience, to rewrite thought, to fracture identity until the subject was no longer a person, but a tool. In many ways, the control collar is the spiritual descendant of MK-Ultra. One overt, one covered. Yet both share the same cold logic: if you can own someone's mind, their body follows without resistance. On the battlefield, the collar was efficient. A flick of a switch, and pain lanced through nerves like liquid fire. A second command, and the wearer's muscles locked, betraying flesh to the will of another. No walls. No guards. Just a loop of metal and the ever-present threat of agony. But the true genius, the true horror, was subtler. Over time, the collar became unnecessary. The memory of pain, the anticipation of punishment, was often more effective than the device itself. This phenomenon is well documented in psychological studies. Learned helplessness, they call it. When subjected to inescapable suffering, an individual ceases to resist, even when avenues of escape are presented. The body is free, but the mind remains in chains. The victims of MK Ultra exhibited similar symptoms: fractured personalities, dissociation, the erosion of the self until only compliance remained. In Sci-Fi, we romanticize the breaking of such chains. The rogue cyborg reclaiming their autonomy, the alien slave rising against their masters. But reality is harsher. Reclaiming one's mind is not an act of singular defiance. It is a war of attrition, a slow, grinding reclamation of self from the depths of programmed obedience. When HFY snapped that collar in Part 1, it was not merely a gesture of liberation. It was an act of rebellion against an entire philosophy that power is justified by the capacity to exert it. But the collar was only the surface manifestation. The deeper chains, the ones etched into the neural pathways of the enslaved, remained. Invisible, insidious, far harder to break. Imagine the alien woman, free in body yet imprisoned by reflex. Every movement calculated to avoid imagined pain. Every thought shadowed by the expectation of command. She no longer needed the collar, the memory sufficed. This is the true triumph of psychological slavery, not in the act of controlling, but in the illusion that control is eternal. History provides brutal parallels. The comfort women of World War II, forced into servitude, often found themselves ostracized even after liberation, trapped by societal stigma, their identities forever defined by the chains once visible. Similarly, the victims of the Soviet gulags, though physically freed, carried the scars of indoctrination, suspicion, and institutionalized dehumanization for the rest of their lives. The control collar is a symbol, yes, but more importantly, it is a mirror. It reflects how civilizations, both real and imagined, seek efficiency in subjugation. Why expend resources on prisons when the mind can become its own cell? Why deploy legions of enforcers when fear can reside comfortably within the skull? And yet, the mere act of questioning this paradigm is itself an act of revolution. In the dark corridors of speculative fiction, there is a recurring motif: the sleeper awakening. The moment when the enslaved mind reclaims its sovereignty. But even this is rarely portrayed in its true complexity. The journey is not cinematic. It is not a sudden surge of triumphant defiance. It is, instead, 1,000 quiet decisions. A refusal to obey. A flicker of doubt. A whispered thought, what if I am more than this? For Sile, the alien woman, the absence of the collar's weight was only the first step. The greater battle awaited within. Every choice she made henceforth would be a confrontation with the ghosts of control, a delicate excavation of self from the rubble of imposed obedience. And this is where sci-fi touches upon the universal. For in our own world, how many wear invisible collars? How many are shackled by expectation, by indoctrination, by the insidious weight of learned submission? The mechanisms differ, but the principle remains. To be free is to fight not only against oppressors but against the parts of ourselves that have come to accept the oppression as normal. The danger of devices like the control collar lies not in their technological sophistication, but in the ease with which they externalize what society has long perfected internally. Control is not new. It has merely evolved from the lash, to the law, to the subtle reprogramming of the mind. As the sun set upon the battlefield of Part 2, the true war reveals itself, not one of nations, not of species, but of will. Flesh can heal. Chains can be broken. but the reclamation of the mind that is the war that defines whether victory is real, or merely a quieter form of defeat. The collar was not designed to be fragile. It was engineered to endure plasma storms, kinetic impacts, the tremors of a dying world. Its alloy, interwoven with alien biometal, responded only to authorized frequencies. But as Commander Kael Vareth's fingers curled around the clasp, the collar's structural integrity meant nothing. Because it was never about strength. It was about will. Kael could feel the subtle pulse of the device beneath his thumb, an imitation heartbeat, cold and precise. It thrummed with the same rhythm that once dictated another being's pain, another being's obedience. The glow was faint, but it was not dying. It was waiting. Waiting for the next command, for the next assertion of dominion. The alien woman before him remained silent. Her posture was perfect in its stillness, but it was not the poise of serenity, it was the learned stillness of prey, of one who knows that sudden movement invites the lash. Her breath was shallow, as if fearing the intake of air might be deemed an act of defiance. Kael recognized it. He had seen it in the liberated zones of his own world, in the eyes of those who had been freed yet remained ensnared by chains no longer visible. The soldiers around them did not understand the gravity of what was about to unfold. To them, this was a gesture of mercy, perhaps even magnanimity. But Kael knew better. Breaking the collar was not the end of her enslavement. It was the first battle of a far deeper war, the war within. With a sharp twist, the lock yielded. Sparks hissed as the interface circuits overloaded, and the device, so proud in its silent tyranny, fell to the ground with a hollow, meaningless clatter. The sound echoed across the courtyard, louder than the artillery fire that had preceded it. Louder, because it was the sound of a cycle fracturing. Yet the woman did not react as they had hoped. There was no gasp of gratitude, no tearful collapse into the arms of her liberator. Her hands remained at her sides, fingers curling slightly as if testing the unfamiliar sensation of autonomy. Freedom, as Kael understood, was not an immediate balm. It was a wound that demanded its own painful healing. In the grand annals of human history, there is no shortage of chains broken by righteous hands. The Emancipation Proclamation, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the uprisings against colonial yokes. But these were merely the visible ruptures. The real battle, the one fought in minds and hearts, always continued in silence, long after the symbols of oppression lay in ruins. Kael thought of the archives, of historical records that chronicled the cycle with academic detachment. Liberation, exploitation, rebellion, and back again. Each era believing itself the harbinger of true freedom, each forgetting that to grant freedom is not an act of power but an act of surrendering power. This was the essence of his choice. By breaking the collar, he had not freed the woman. He had relinquished his claim to her. He had rejected the insidious privilege of ownership that conquest whispered into the ears of victors. In that moment, Kael was not the commander of a victorious fleet. He was merely a man choosing not to be a tyrant. The alien's eyes, iridescent and unblinking, lifted to meet his. It was not a gaze of thanks, nor of suspicion. It was a gaze of calculation, of a mind evaluating whether this moment was genuine, or merely another variation of control disguised as charity. And Kael welcomed it. For true freedom does not demand gratitude. It demands choice. The right to question, to doubt, to refuse. In the depths of history, philosophers had debated the nature of liberty. Is it a gift? A right? An illusion? But standing there, amidst the rubble of a fallen regime, Kael understood, freedom is a choice by the giver to release, and by the receiver to accept or reject. The collar on the ground was inert. but the chains within would take longer to unfasten. Perhaps they never fully would. Perhaps that was not his battle to fight. But what mattered, what would echo in the memories of this war, was that someone had made the choice to break the pattern. To shatter, even for a breath, the belief that power justified possession. And as the suns dipped below the horizon, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch from Kael's boots to the very stars, he realized the magnitude of this act. This was not just the breaking of a collar. This was a crack in the cycle of dominion that had perpetuated itself across species, across centuries. The alien woman straightened, the subtle tremor in her limbs betraying the titanic effort of standing unshackled for the first time. There was no need for words. The silence between them was richer, more profound, than any declaration. For in that silence lived the true essence of rebellion, not in the raising of arms, but in the refusal to bow. And Kael, though a soldier by trade, understood this truth more deeply than any victory he had ever claimed. The ship breathed in low, mechanical sighs, a rhythm so steady that it faded into the mind's background until silence made it deafening. Within those narrow corridors, beneath the hum of life support and the flicker of dying console lights, she moved like a ghost. Not a spirit haunting others, but a fragment haunting herself. No longer chained, no longer commanded, yet every step she took was dictated by patterns carved deep beneath her skin. She avoided the central walkway instinctively, favoring the edges where shadows cloaked her presence. She did not meet the eyes of the crew, though no one demanded her submission. She ate in isolation, her bites small, mechanical, as though nourishment was a duty, not a choice. The collar was gone, but its absence was merely physical, its imprint remained, invisible and far more insidious. Kael Vareth had freed her body. But freedom of the mind is not something bestowed, it is something clawed back, piece by fragile piece. Psychologists on Earth once named it PTSD, a clinical acronym that failed to capture the suffocating weight of relived terror. She lived each breath as though bracing for the shock of pain, each sound filtered through a survival instinct honed to perfection. The corridors of the ship became an endless loop of cautious anticipation. A flicker of light might be a trigger command, a shift in tone could herald punishment. The logical mind understood she was no longer under their control. The conditioned mind obeyed out of habit. This was the battlefield no warlord could see. A silent war waged within the confines of her own bones. The ship's crew whispered of her like she was a shade, a remnant of the conquered. Yet Kael knew better. He had seen such ghosts before in his comrades, in his reflection. Trauma does not vanish with the fall of empires. It embeds itself, burrows into identity, reshapes the self until one forgets where the invader ends and the victim begins. Some called it Stockholm Syndrome, the grotesque irony where the enslaved finds solace in their captor, a perverse recalibration of survival. But what of those who did not feel loyalty, only emptiness? Where was their category? Their name? She was not grateful for her captivity. Nor did she hate herself for enduring it. She was, simply, fractured. Kael observed her repairing auxiliary systems with a precision that was too controlled, too deliberate. Each motion was an echo of forced labor, yet beneath that rote efficiency was something new, a question forming, hesitant but persistent: what does it mean to act by my own will? The journey of reclamation is never dramatic. It is not a cinematic uprising. It is quiet, painfully slow. 1,000 micro-rebellions, choosing to speak, choosing not to flinch, choosing to rest when no one is watching. In the archives of human memory, similar stories echoed. The prawn in District 9, dehumanized, marginalized, forced into slums, not by the virtue of inferiority, but by the ease with which the powerful rationalize oppression. Yet, when opportunity flickered, agency returned not in grand gestures, but in the simple assertion of identity. I am not what you made me to be. Or Ava, from Ex Machina, whose journey from artificial intelligence to self-liberation was not a violent revolution, but a masterclass in quiet defiance. She smiled, she learned, she adapted not out of rebellion, but out of an innate, inalienable right to exist on her own terms. The alien woman aboard Kael's ship was no different. Her war was not with Kael, nor with those who had enslaved her. Her war was with the learned silence that filled every room she entered. With the echo of commands that no longer arrived, yet still dictated her breath. Kael never pressed her. He understood that trust is not earned through demands. He left the tools where she would find them, tasks undone not as orders, but as opportunities. And slowly, imperceptibly, the ship changed. A relay rerouted without instruction. A flickering panel stabilized in the dead of night. No fanfare. No reports. Just silent acts of reclamation. In those small repairs, she was not serving. She was redefining her place within a world that had reduced her to a function. The pivotal moment came without witnesses. Alone in the engine bay, beneath the artificial glow of reactor lights, she stood before a diagnostic console. The screen flickered with a fault, a minor issue, easily ignored. She reached out, her fingers hovering above the input panel. And then she paused. This was not an order. This was not a demand. The choice was hers. Her hand settled on the panel, deliberate. The fault resolved. The console stabilized. And in that breath, the woman who had been property became a person. Not because of grand declarations, but because of a single, sovereign decision. Kael, observing unseen, understood the magnitude of that moment. Liberation is not a singular event. It is a process. A choice made, remade, and defended with every breath. The ghosts on the ship were not banished by force. They were exorcised by patience, by space, by the quiet rebuilding of a fractured will. As the ship sailed through the void, its systems purring with newfound stability, the woman walked its halls with a different gait. Subtle, but real. No longer avoiding the center path. No longer shrinking from shadows. The chains within had begun to loosen, not by external force, but by her own, painstaking reclamation. The ship had once been a war machine, its every circuit humming with purpose defined by conflict. But now, in the hush of peacetime, it drifted through the void like a wounded leviathan, its systems scarred by the echoes of battles past. Panels flickered with inconsistencies. Coolant lines whispered of impending failure. Beneath the seamless alloy skin, the vessel bled entropy. She understood that feeling too well. Her hands, once forced into repetitive maintenance under the command of others, now hovered over the exposed internals of the ship not as a servant, but as a surgeon. Each motion, precise yet deliberate, was no longer an act of obedience. It was reclamation. The act of restoring function became, paradoxically, the act of rebuilding self. The conduit array before her was a labyrinth of alien and human design, a chaotic fusion born of necessity during the war. Hybrid interfaces meshed with patched together human engineering, imperfect, unstable, yet functional in its defiant refusal to collapse. Much like herself. She traced the fractures in the alloy with fingertips that remembered their own fractures. Every burnt relay was a memory. Every frayed connection whispered of captivity, of survival. Kael Vareth watched from the gantry above, silent. He knew this was not about the ship. In the philosophy of her people, to mend was not merely to repair, but to realign. There existed no word for fix in her tongue, only to restore harmony. The ship's systems were extensions of the self, and in healing them, she confronted the dissonance within. Every recalibrated sensor was a recalibration of fractured identity. Every sealed microfracture was an assertion that broken did not mean worthless. Science fiction had long speculated on the interplay between human and machine, but few had captured the brutal intimacy of such a process. To interface with technology is to confront one's own limitations. In the post-war age, machines bore the same scars as their makers, patched, jury-rigged, held together by willpower and improvisation. And yet, in that imperfection, there was beauty. Survival was not pristine. It was a tapestry of flaws, woven together with persistence. The ship's primary coolant manifold hissed, a minor leak manifesting as a thin veil of vapor. She did not flinch. Instead, she adjusted the flow regulators with a deftness born not of training, but of experience paid for in pain. The hiss subsided. The ship exhaled. So did she. Kael recalled how human engineers viewed their craft as problem-solving, a detached, mechanical exercise. But for her, this was ritual. Not religious, but existential. To repair was to reclaim authorship over her narrative. No longer a pawn moved by orders, she wrote each line of her purpose with every tightened seal, every recalibrated output. In the annals of speculative history, great minds had often blurred the line between self and machine. The cybernetic philosophers of old Earth, the augment lords of Mars, all had pursued the fusion of flesh and function. But few understood the emotional gravity of that fusion. It was not power they sought, it was continuity. A way to hold onto fragments of self when flesh proved too fragile to carry the weight of memory. She was not augmenting herself with machinery. She was aligning her fractured self through the act of engineering. Each component was a reflection, a facet of identity once denied. The ship, in its battered resilience, became a mirror. Its restoration was a manifesto: I am not what was done to me. I am what I choose to rebuild. As her fingers danced across the control panel, bypassing corrupted nodes, rerouting power through less efficient yet stable pathways, Kael saw it not merely the repair of systems, but the architecture of healing. This was therapy, far more effective than any psychologist's chair. The ship did not pity. It did not judge. It simply responded. Input, feedback, correction. A dialogue of circuits and synapses, where success was tangible, measurable. Near the heart of the engine bay, she confronted the primary power core, its hum uneven, symptomatic of deeper instability. To access its calibration matrix, she had to disengage the safety interlocks manually. The procedure was meticulous, requiring focus, trust in her own precision. There was no command to follow, no overseer dictating steps. Every decision was hers. And as she realigned the core's harmonic dampeners, the ship's tremors subsided. Stability returned, not just to the vessel, but to the space within her own mind where chaos had once nested. For the first time, the ship was silent, not broken, but balanced. She stood back, breath steady, fingers tingling with the residue of energy dissipated through the control nodes. The woman who had been a labor unit, a technical asset, was now the architect of her own function. The labels they had branded upon her held no weight here. Kael descended the gantry, his boots echoing softly against the grated flooring. He said nothing, for words would only diminish the magnitude of what had transpired. This was not gratitude he owed her. It was respect. The ship's systems chimed a soft confirmation of full operational stability. But in truth, it was not the ship that had been restored. It was her name. Not the one given by captors, nor the one recorded in enemy databases, but the name she reclaimed through every act of purpose. In the stillness that followed, Kael understood, the greatest rebellion is to define oneself through creation, not destruction. The observation deck was never meant for reflection. A functional platform, nothing more, plating reinforced to withstand micrometeor impacts, utility panels inset with cold precision, devoid of any design that spoke of beauty. Yet in the expanse beyond the translucent shielding, the stars spilled across the void in chaotic, unrepentant brilliance. No pattern, no order, just the raw infinity of existence laid bare. She stood there, silent, the artificial gravity anchoring her body while her thoughts floated weightless. The stars did not care who she was. Not a prisoner. Not a fugitive. Not an asset. To them, she was simply a presence, a flicker of bioelectric heat against the cold tapestry of space. Her fingers brushed the reinforced glass, a gesture both futile and instinctive. There was no touch that could bridge the distance to those distant lights, and yet, in that unreachable expanse, she found a mirror more honest than any she had faced. The universe did not demand her obedience. It did not catalog her worth. It simply existed, vast and indifferent, offering no answers, yet refusing to impose questions. Kael Vareth watched from the shadows, understanding the sanctity of this moment. Words would be an intrusion. This was not a dialogue. It was a communion. For her people, the stars had always been home. Nomadic by necessity, they had wandered the currents of space, tracing ancient stellar paths with vessels that sang in harmony with the void. Settlement was not their way. To settle was to stagnate. To them, the concept of ownership was an absurdity. Land, planets, even bodies, were but temporary vessels. Only movement was eternal. Only the journey mattered. In stark contrast, Kael's own culture had waged countless wars over boundaries, over the illusion that a plot of land could define existence. His world had drawn lines on maps, bled for imaginary constructs of nation and dominion. But here, beneath the stars, those lines were meaningless. The stars belonged to no one. And in their infinite distance, they offered a quiet, brutal truth: freedom is not something given. It is something lived. She exhaled, slow and deliberate, her breath fogging the barrier for a brief, insignificant heartbeat. That ephemeral cloud dissipated, consumed by the environmental stabilizers, much like identities consumed by the expectations of others. But even as it vanished, the act remained hers. Chosen. Willed. A defiant claim of presence against the suffocating indifference of space. Human philosophers once spoke of the overview effect, the profound shift in perspective when seeing Earth from orbit, a fragile sphere suspended in blackness, devoid of borders, of divisions. Astronauts returned changed, their concepts of conflict rendered trivial by the sheer scale of the cosmos. She needed no such voyage. For her, this understanding was ancestral, coded into her very being. The stars were not a destination. They were a reflection of self. In the culture of nomadic tribes, be they the steppe riders of old Earth or the voidfarers of alien lineage, the sky had always symbolized possibility. The Boutroy Mo, as some ancient Terran tongues had named it, was not merely a physical expanse but a metaphysical canvas upon which freedom was painted stroke by uncertain stroke. To move beneath it was to breathe autonomy. To navigate its vastness was to reject confinement not just of body, but of identity. Kael recalled the scholars who likened space travel to a spiritual pilgrimage. Not an escape, but a quest not to find new worlds, but to find oneself in the reflection of the stars. Here, in this moment, he saw that truth embodied not in grand proclamations, but in the quiet way she stood, claiming no space, yet owning her existence entirely. For years, she had been defined by others. By the weight of chains, by the sting of commands, by the hollow title of labor unit. But here, beneath the indifferent stars, none of those labels could survive. The universe had no interest in her past. It demanded nothing, offered nothing. And in that apathy, she found the first true taste of freedom. Not the freedom of movement she had walked freely through the ship's corridors for days. Not the freedom of speech no one silenced her anymore. But the freedom to exist without justification. To be, without needing to explain the how or the why. Kael watched her lift her hand once more, this time not to reach, but to trace idle patterns against the barrier. There was no urgency, no purpose beyond the simple act of being. In that moment, she was not the remnant of a conquered race, not the survivor of engineered obedience. She was herself undefined, unclaimed, unbound. The stars watched in their distant, silent way. And for once, that was enough. The docking bay reeked of ozone and scorched alloy, the aftermath of a skirmish too sudden to be formal, too personal to be dismissed. Blaster scars etched blackened lines across the walls, a harsh calligraphy spelling out the chaotic language of survival. The air crackled with static, every breath tasting faintly of burned circuits and the copper tang of blood. Kael Vareth crouched behind a supply crate, his pulse pounding a tempo older than reason. The ambush had been precise, mercenary, efficient, born not of vengeance, but of contract. His sidearm, once an extension of instinct, now felt heavier, more reluctant in his grip. Ammunition dwindled. Cover evaporated with each precision strike. The news tightened. Across the bay, moving with a grace tempered by necessity, she appeared not the ghostly figure of the once enslaved, but a presence coalescing into something sharp, deliberate. Her hands, familiar with the internals of ships, now gripped the cold certainty of a blaster. She did not falter. No command spurred her forward. No obligation shackled her limbs. This was choice. Pure. Sovereign. When the shot came, searing heat slicing through Kael's shoulder, the pain was immediate, visceral, but not unexpected. His body betrayed him, balance skewed, vision narrowing. Yet before gravity could claim him, she was there. Smaller in stature, but formidable in intent, she anchored his weight against hers, her breath a steady counterpoint to the chaos. There was no hesitation in her movements. No flinching. She did not save him out of debt, nor out of pity. She saved him because in this crucible of violence, the roles of rescuer and rescued had dissolved into irrelevance. They moved as one. No words. No strategy sessions. Just the raw, unspoken synergy of two beings no longer defined by the illusion of hierarchy. The ramp loomed ahead, salvation etched in steel, yet every meter demanded its own tribute in fire and resolve. The moment they breached the threshold, the ship's systems, half repaired by her meticulous hands, welcomed them with shields flaring to life, a silent testament that salvation was no longer a gift bestowed by one upon another, but a construct of shared will. In the medbay's sterile glow, as Kael's wound was cauterized with clinical detachment, she stood sentinel. Not as a subordinate awaiting orders, but as an equal, her posture radiating a fierce, quiet protectiveness. The circle had completed itself not as a cycle of dependency, but as a closed loop of mutual preservation. Human history had always romanticized the act of saving. the hero, elevated upon the pedestal of sacrifice, their valor measured by the helplessness of those they saved. But this narrative was flawed, shallow. It ignored the profound truth that true strength is not found in lifting others from the abyss, but in offering a hand without expectation, in accepting that same hand when one's own grip falters. The philosophy of the Vongtran Traik and Heem had long existed in the oral traditions of nomadic cultures. In such societies, the individual thrived not by dominance, but by interdependence. The hunter fed the healer. The healer mended the warrior. The warrior defended the child. And in time, the child would safeguard the future of them all. No role permanent. No hierarchy absolute. Only the flow of responsibility, shifting as need dictated. In this unspoken compact, Kael and she had found their equilibrium. He had broken her chains, not to own her freedom, but to release himself from the burden of being a savior. In turn, she had steadied his fall, not out of obligation, but from the simple, unadorned fact that she could, and chose to do so. The battlefield was no longer a place of one-sided valor. It had become an arena where identities fractured by past definitions could be reforged not in solitude, but in partnership. When the alarm subsided, when the ship's systems stabilized beneath her hands once more, Kael realized the battle had not merely been for survival. It had been a crucible, burning away the remnants of the savior complex he had worn like armor. In its place stood something rarer, the humility to accept rescue, and the wisdom to recognize strength not as dominance, but as reciprocity. She passed him a fresh power cell with the same ease she had once recalibrated the ship's coolant flow. No ceremony. No weight of debt. Just two beings, navigating a universe indifferent to both their pasts, choosing again and again to stand beside each other. And in that choice, they were no longer rescuer and rescued. They were partners. The ship's cockpit was not designed for two. The co-pilot's seat had remained folded, an afterthought of redundancy rather than necessity. For Kael Vareth, it had always been empty space that symbolized his solitary command, his self-imposed isolation. Until now. When he gestured to that seat, inviting her to claim it not as a passenger, not as cargo, but as co-pilot, the gesture was deceptively simple. Yet within its simplicity lay the quiet detonation of a centuries-old paradigm. She did not rush to accept. Her movements were measured, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding the weight of the invitation. This was not about steering a vessel. It was about navigating the delicate architecture of trust rebuilt from ruin. The title of co-pilot was not a gift. It was not a favor. It was a declaration of equality, born not of obligation, but of earned recognition. In the mirror of history, Kael could see the echoes. After the fires of Vietnam had smoldered into uneasy ceasefires, there came moments rare, fragile where former adversaries extended hands, not in grudging truce, but in genuine partnership. Q Ben Mai, men who had once seen Vietnam through the fog of conflict, returned not with rifles, but with tools, rebuilding what their past selves had helped shatter. Bridges restored by those who had once burned them. Fields replanted where craters had marred the earth. Not out of guilt, but out of a hard-won understanding, true reconciliation is built with hands that once wielded weapons, now open in shared labor. So too was this moment. She settled into the seat with no fanfare. The restrained harness folded across her chest not as a tether, but as a symbol of her chosen place. Her fingers, once forced into tasks beneath commands, now moved across the console with the deft assurance of a peer. The ship responded, subtle calibrations aligning, systems humming in acknowledgement. There was no need for words. The act itself was its own lexicon. Kael's gaze lingered not on the controls, but on the fluidity of her movements. No longer mechanical. No longer burdened by the fear of error. She was not performing a task assigned. She was exercising authority co-owned. In the shared space of that cockpit, the boundaries of their prior roles dissolved. The trauma of war brands all who survive it, but the aftermath offers a singular choice: to remain trapped within the identities forged by conflict, or to redefine oneself through the crucible of shared purpose. The transformation from rescuer and rescued into partners was not an erasure of past wounds. It was a reweaving of narrative threads, allowing those wounds to become the seams of something stronger. In the soft luminescence of the command deck, Kael thought of the veterans who had walked through the villages they once shelled, shoulder to shoulder with those who had once fired back. Not to erase history, but to acknowledge its weight and choose to carry it together. A bond not born of victory, but of mutual survival. Not forged in bloodshed, but in the patient act of rebuilding. He could see the same dynamic unfolding here. The titles of commander, of captive, of liberator, they no longer held dominion. What remained was function, competence, trust honed through shared adversity. They were not bound by gratitude, nor by lingering debts. The bond had evolved, not into something sentimental, but into something practical, essential. A partnership dictated not by mercy, but by the undeniable fact that together, they were more than the sum of their scars. When she recalibrated the ship's navigation vector, fine-tuning the sublight trajectory with a precision Kael himself could not match, it was not a moment of her proving herself. It was a demonstration that proof was no longer necessary. Competence was its own justification. Their conversation was sparse, yet rich in subtext. A glance sufficed where orders once existed. A subtle shift in tone replaced what used to require commands. In that silence, an old bond found its new name, not chains of obligation, but threads of interwoven agency. The galaxy remained as indifferent, as hostile as ever. But within that cockpit, two beings who had once occupied opposite sides of a war now steered the same course, not as relics of a shattered hierarchy, but as co-architects of a shared future. The seat beside him was no longer empty. The transmission pulsed like a heartbeat on the console, steady, insistent, indifferent to the hesitation that had settled in Kael Vareth's bones. The message itself was simple. Coordinates. A directive. The cold vocabulary of military necessity, sterile in tone, but beneath it, the weight was suffocating. They needed him again. Not as Kael, not as the man who had chosen to walk away, but as the symbol he had once been: a commander, a weapon. He stared at the blinking indicator, feeling the echo of old wounds rise from beneath the scar tissue. The war had ended, they said. Treaties signed. Sectors declared neutral. Yet the demands of power did not recognize ceasefires. They had merely found new names, new theaters, new masks to disguise the same insatiable hunger for control. Across the cockpit, she worked in silence. Her presence was no longer a disruption to his command space. It was an anchor. Yet Kael could see it: the subtle tension in her shoulders, the slight hesitation in her movements. She too recognized the call for what it was, not a summons, but a chain, freshly forged from the remnants of old obligations. In the hollow corridors of sci-fi legends, this narrative was all too familiar. Shepherd in Mass Effect, burdened not just with the survival of species, but with the crushing weight of decisions that blurred the line between duty and identity. Commander Adama in Battlestar Galactica, a leader haunted by the paradox of protecting his people while slowly becoming the very thing he feared. These were not heroes born of glory. They were veterans, carrying the guilt of survival, of choices made in the shadow of impossible consequences. Kael was no different. The war had imprinted itself upon his DNA, not through genetic engineering, but through the relentless erosion of self beneath the demands of necessity. Every order obeyed, every enemy neutralized, had chipped away at the man until only the function remained. Now, as the universe reached out once more with its cold, grasping fingers, the question loomed, could he refuse? Was there even a version of Kael Vareth that existed outside the context of conflict? She said nothing, but her gaze met his, unflinching, steady. In her eyes, he saw not expectation, but challenge. The same silent defiance that had refused to let her remain defined by her chains now reflected back at him, daring him to confront his own. Duty, as Kael had learned, was a double-edged blade. It could be a compass, guiding through chaos. But left unchecked, it became a leash, one disguised as virtue. The organization, the command structure, had always framed duty as service to protect, to uphold. Yet time and again, it had demanded obedience that hollowed out the soul. In that cockpit, beneath the indifferent stars, Kael faced the mirror of his own making. He had walked away from the war, but the war had not walked away from him. The transmission pulsed again, insistent. But this time, he understood, responding was not surrendering. Ignoring was not freedom. True autonomy lay not in rejection or compliance, but in choosing why. The weight of the past was not a shackle unless he allowed it to be. The guilt of survival, the scars of command, these were not chains, but markers of experience. The decision before him was not about obligation to an organization. It was about allegiance to the principles that had driven him to fight in the first place. He recalled Shepard's defiance not against orders, but against the perversion of those orders into tools of oppression. He remembered Adama's relentless pursuit of humanity, not as a strategic objective, but as a moral imperative. Their stories were not victories of militarism. They were testimonies of individuals reclaiming agency from the very systems that sought to consume them. Kael inhaled slowly, the recycled air of the ship filling his lungs with mechanical indifference. Then, without drama, he activated the transmission. His voice was steady, devoid of the brittle sharpness of obligation. This time, we do it on our terms. Beside him, she did not smile, but her posture shifted. A subtle relaxation, not of relief, but of shared resolve. They were not pawns in a war they had once survived. They were architects of how they would face what came next. In that moment, Kael Vareth was no longer a commander answering a call. He was a man, standing beside a partner, choosing deliberately to engage, not out of duty, but out of conviction. The war never ends. But neither does the choice of who you become within it. The ship did not roar into the void. It hummed a low, resonant vibration that whispered of momentum, of mass displacing itself across the stars with purpose rather than haste. Beyond the reinforced viewport, the universe unfolded in silent brilliance. The swirl of nebulae, the cold gleam of distant suns, the shifting tapestry of cosmic dust, it was not a backdrop, but a realm of possibilities, each star a doorway to a future unclaimed. Two figures sat in tandem at the helm. Kael Vareth, once commander, once liberator, now simply Kael, his hands resting with deliberate ease upon the navigation controls, not gripping, not commanding, but guiding. Beside him, she occupied the co-pilot's seat, not as an extension of his command, but as the axis upon which the journey balanced. Her fingers danced across the interface, recalibrating trajectories, aligning systems not to obey, but to build. The symmetry of their presence was subtle yet profound. Not master and subordinate. Not rescuer and rescued. But partners, aligned not by circumstance, but by choice. The term co-pilot carried a simplicity that belied its weight. It was not a secondary role, not a position of lesser command. In the crucible of deep space navigation, co-pilot meant equal responsibility, shared destiny. To pilot was to lead. To co-pilot was to trust, to synchronize. Every decision was a dialogue. Every correction a conversation of intent. Her voice, when it came, was measured not the brittle tone of someone asserting newfound agency, but the quiet confidence of one who no longer needed to prove possession of it. Vector drift compensated. Secondary shields holding at 96%. Kael nodded, not in approval, but in acknowledgement. The exchange was functional, efficient. Yet beneath it pulsed a deeper current, the unspoken affirmation of their shared authorship of this journey. Freedom had always been framed as a singular act. A chain broken. A gate opened. But here, amidst the silent infinity, the truth revealed itself with crystalline clarity: freedom is not given. It is chosen. Chosen again and again, in every step, in every breath, in every act of shared purpose. The mythology of lone heroes dissolves in the vacuum of space. No one navigates the void alone. The great captains of history, the legendary explorers beneath every name etched in archives, were the hands, the minds, the hearts of those who co-piloted their legacies. Names forgotten by design, yet integral to every victory. In this ship, in this moment, the bond was not written in titles, but in the seamless choreography of movement. He adjusted course. She recalibrated thrust vectors. He monitored systems. She predicted stress fractures in shielding integrity. The vessel thrived not because of command, but because of collaboration. Kael remembered the ancient fable of the two oars from Terran's seafaring lore. A boat propelled by one oar spun endlessly in place. Only when two oars moved in harmony did the vessel carve a true path through turbulent waters. This ship was no different. The oars were not physical, but they were real, embodied in choice, in trust, in mutual respect. She had once been an object, a prize of war, a designation in a manifest. Now, with each calculated maneuver, with each shared breath beneath the hum of the engines, she authored her own narrative. Not in isolation, but in deliberate partnership. He glanced at her not as an afterthought, but as a reflection of the path they had chosen. The scars of their respective pasts had not vanished. They remained, etched into memory, into bone. But scars, by their very nature, are the body's testament to healing, to survival, to continuation. The universe remained vast, indifferent. It did not applaud their partnership. It did not validate their choices. And therein lay the purity of their freedom. No empire had granted it. No decree had sanctioned it. They had seized it, nurtured it, and now, they piloted it together. In the quiet rhythm of shared control inputs, in the subtle give and take of command, the lesson crystallized. Freedom is not escape. Freedom is not defiance. Freedom is co-authorship. It is a journey navigated not in solitude, but in chosen alliance. The ship surged forward, not in rebellion, not in flight, but in deliberate exploration. Two beings, once defined by chains, one visible, one invisible, now defined themselves by a choice made in tandem. Not because they were free, but because they had chosen to be together. In the end, this was never a story about war. It was about two beings, broken in different ways, finding not redemption, but choice. Not a chain broken by one, but a bond forged by both. Freedom, as we've seen, isn't a prize. It's a constant decision. A co-pilot's journey. Now, I want to hear from you. Which moment in this story struck you the most? Was it the breaking of the collar? The moment she chose to save him in battle? Or the quiet defiance of sitting side by side, piloting the unknown together? If you were in Kael's place, would you have answered the call from the past? Or if you were in her position, would you have dared to reclaim your identity so boldly? Imagine yourself as the co-pilot. What would freedom mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want more stories that explore alien encounters, human choices, and the thin line between conqueror and companion, subscribe now to the Alien Storyverse. Let's explore these stories together. Until next time, pilot your own path.